Hey guys, for my project, I chose to look at subsistence fishing in Southeast Alaska, more specifically looking at the pre contact lifestyle that many cultural anthropologists like to focus on. Now, the big point of data where most of the information that we're going to be getting about this time will be coming from is from ethnographic data and from the archaeological record. And they both have things that they do well and then things that they don't do as well. One of the problems with using ethnographies is if you use more recent ethnographies, it's literally ethnographies hundreds of years after colonization. So it doesn't really work too much to portray the culture very well, as they've changed too much in that time. And even if the elders remember, it still might be biased. And one of the problems with early ethnographies is there's a big lack of data, and there are tons of biases coming from the person taking these ethnographies. They are definitely not participating in participant observation and doing what we would consider good anthropology now. So a lot of those early ethnographies have problems as well, and they don't really fully represent a pre-context society, as in some way, some of the colonizing culture could be affecting these societies already during the time of this ethnography. So the big question from here is, where do we go from this point? And the clearest point forward would be to go to the archaeological record, because it has the clearest perspective, but at the same time, it's the most clouded. Because on one hand, the archaeological record literally comes from the material culture that comes from that society. But on the other hand, basically archaeologists are excavating trash and basically what people left behind. So this might not fully represent what the culture is all about. And another big important role is preservation, because if things are going to degrade over time and not show up in the archaeological record, that's a potential bias that really needs to be taken account for, because if you're not finding it, then something's being left out. Now, the idea that we can do going forward then is a combining of ethnographic data and the archaeological data, and that would probably be the best route going forward. So I'm focusing on fishing in Southeast Alaska because fishing is such an important part of this society, and it can provide lots of insights on the culture it represents. More specifically, I'm looking at the types of fish being caught, the different technologies used for these fish, meaning the types that are used for fishing and the types that are used for post-fishing processes, and the specific archaeological sites and their importance. Now, these subsistence practices can really shed a lot of light because it's coming straight from the ground. There's no biases that can really be as far as analyzing it, and it can really help with learning about these pre-contact societies. As for this is a artistic representation of the Palearctic salmon runs, and I would really suggest it. The Gates of the Arctic National Park puts out these kind of representations every year, and they have some really cool ones, so I would really go check this out. Now, looking into the types of fish, the biggest and one that is most looked at in Southeast is salmon, and this is because it is high use. In almost all sites, salmon dominate the faunal assemblages, but there are some problems that come with it. People suffer from, as some anthropologists would term it, salmonopia, meaning almost everything in the culture is attributed to salmon. Now, this is cause for some really big biases, as obviously not everything comes from salmon, and there are other fish that people are going for. So while salmon is really important to the Southeast, we can't think of it as the only fish. So what other fish are there? There are herring, and they're usually considered the second largest producer, as they can be caught for their eggs, their meat, their oil. They have tons of things of uses for, even though they're relatively small. They can be eaten fresh, dried, and smoked. The big problem here is there's a big problem of representation, and this usually comes straight from the excavation of herring. The reason for this is herring are relatively smaller than a lot of the other fish that are being dug up. What happens here then is a lot of the bones are being lost when they're excavating. For example, if you don't screen after you've dug up the dirt, then you're most certainly going to lose the herringbones. And some people have even gone to said that 1/8 screen for screening, herringbones can still fall through and get lost. So even if you use what's considered by archaeologists the best screening method, you can still lose herringbones. So the big thing here is we need to be very, very careful when looking at herringbones and sites, because it can be really easily to lose them. Now, this third fish I'm looking at is the cod, and this is because this is about the third fish people are going for. And on average, cod are relatively larger than herring. They have 3 different species, and all of them are, on average, larger. There are a range of sites with abundance of cod. For example, the Chuck Lake and the Elena Bay Village sites. In those sites, cod represents over around 60% of the faunal assemblages. And if there are reasons why people are going for cod over the herring and the salmon of the world, we need to know why. What spatially is important about these sites over the other sites? So the big important with looking at cod going forward is why are these particular sites have high assemblages of cod, and why don't other sites? Now, the other big important element when looking into fishing is the importance of tools. Now, the problem here is fishing elements, basically archaeological tools used specifically for fishing, are usually not found in the archaeological record because of preservation issues. This is usually because they are made of wood, bone, and fiber, things that usually degrade very easily. And for example, like your harpoon heads made of ivory and bone, those are not going to make it through, and that's a big problem. There are some things that aren't lithic dominated that usually make it through, like birch bark rolls. Birch bark has a bunch of uses. For example, it can be used to carry the salmon after it has been cleaned and cut apart. It can be used for the drying of the salmon and preserving the fish going forward. So birch bark has an important role, and this is good that we found this because wood, like I said, usually doesn't make it. But looking forward, fish processing tools, however, are more common. They're usually dominated by lithics, and this could be a bias in that we think they're dominated by lithics because we find lithics, but this is what we know. The first one I'm going to talk about is the biface. It is a universally useful tool, mostly because bifaces are usually considered projectile points. They usually have the point of hunting big game and having this point that can really do some damage. However, in the setting of fish, their uses go from cutting open the fish, as seen here, to scraping out its guts. And when these bifaces are found with this function in mind, they commonly lack the sharp tip usually found with the hunting aspect. So it signifies this non-hunting function. Now, another one is small scrapers. These are usually associated with the scraping of hide. And in fish processing, they're pretty similar, except they're not scraping hide, they're just scraping the guts out. But the thing with these is they have multiple uses, so you could have them for a hide scraper, but you could also have these small scrapers just to scrape the guts out if you have it. So it could just be a multiple use tool. One of the other big tools is microblades. The problem with microblades is, while they do have functions that could help with fish, they have functions for everything. Microblades are found basically everywhere. These are mostly microblade cores, as you see here. And the argument that can be made here is that the microblades can simply inhabit the toolkit, and meaning they are found in fish sites, but because they're found in other sites, they could just be a universally useful tool that's used for anything. The last one that I'm going to be looking at today is the cobblespall, and this is because it's commonly overlooked. It's because it's a very crude tool, and it's definitely not limited to fish. Its uses in terms of fish is decapitating the fish and cutting through the bones. The big problem here is it will often go unreported in archaeological excavation because of how crude it is. This is one of the examples of it being used, and here are some cobblespalls. But this is what we need as far as diligence looking into archaeological sites. We can't leave these things out, even if they don't look pretty like your basic obsidian point. It needs to be accounted for, even if it's not the best. Now, onto archaeological sites. This is the importance I've been talking about. These are some sites found in the southeast, and more specifically in archaeological sites, fishing sites. And what you usually find in fishing sites is weirs and fish traps. These can be found along the river or the coast, or where the river meets the water. And you have a bunch of different types. They can be made out of wood stakes, they can be made out of stone or basketry. They have multiple uses and multiple ways to make them. And they can be ranged from relatively simple with like one or two openings to very complex where there's different places where the fish can get caught. There's multiple openings. And this is considered the chevron type weir and the heart shaped, and you can see them down here. These ones are usually made out of wood stakes. So the types of material really show something about the culture, basically how much time the people have to be putting for this use. For example, if they make one that's very simple with 20 stakes, they might not have as much time as someone who can make a fishing trap with 100 stakes. And this really kind of shows the pressure that these people are under, how much stress they are for fish at that moment, if they have time to make this elaborate fish trap, or if they just have to make a simple one to get the meal right then and there. It can really tell you a lot about what kind of conditions the people are going through at that time. So another important thing are middens, because middens are, if you look at middens surrounding fish traps, it can really show you what the function of that fish trap is telling you. Because, for example, if you find a fish trap, you don't know what fish they're going for. They could be going for herring, they could be going for salmon, cod. But if you look at some of the middens in the archaeological sites surrounding them, you could look at what fish dominates the assemblage. For example, if herring make up 80% of the faunal assemblage and the other 20% is made up of other fish or big game, then you know that fish trap or weir is potentially going for herring. The evidence points towards that. So these middens really can show what they're going for with the sites. And these middens, specifically you'd look for middens like at fish camps surrounding these weirs or sites. And these are some pictures of shell middens. And the Canadians usually put these cores into middens instead of just excavating them like you see here. So conclusions. What we really need to know going forward is that the combining of ethnographic and archaeological data is extremely useful. We can take the best from both to learn the most about these societies. For example, the ethnographic one will be a little bit more direct, as it will be the one that looks directly at those people. But the archaeology one, in general, will have less biases as far as the person, the archaeologist, looking at the data. Now, fish are super important to learning about Northwest Coast societies, and there's a lot of data out there. The big problem is that a lot of archaeologists have this small scope concerning fish. It's not just about salmon. We have to understand these other herring and cods of the world. We must know that they're going for other fish. And we have to ask ourselves, why? Is the herring run, could it have been late? Or the salmon run, I'm sorry. And is it just easier to get herring? Is a spawn herring location near there? These are the questions that can be answered. And the other big thing is more diligence in proper excavations. If going forward, we're better at excavating as long as the information does not have a threat of being lost. As long as we have proper excavations, we can learn the most. We can not miss out on those herring bones, and we can not lose the cobble spalls. So overall, this advantage of fish can be really useful in learning the most about pre-contact societies. So that's my project. Thanks you guys for listening.